Right, okay, that's it. So, good evening, everybody. Um, it's Dino here to my left, me over here, separated by, don't know, 100 miles or something. Anyway, Dino has some more karting experiences. He is let's just say, the cart busting Scottish king, and he's got some more experiences for us. This time, he's going to be dealing with some karting experience in relation to my favorite subject, and that's, of course, dealing with the generations. So take it away, Dino.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, so one of the first things I looked at when I started taking an interest in these things again was the explained video on the generations. I'd been referred there by a sister that I knew. So I had a look at it, and my first thoughts on it was it just didn't make proper sense, and it didn't really look to the scriptures. There was no scriptural references involved in it. But when I first watched it, I think I got a slight misunderstanding of what it was saying. Because I thought he was saying that there were two generations. But I think that's an easy mistake to make because if you're talking about a group of people who lived from 1914 onwards and lived all through that period through the two great wars, and then you start speaking about a group of people much later in the 20th century, then common sense says you're talking about two different generations of people. So that's the kind of mistake I took from it. And when I looked at it a few more times and read more about it, I realized they were actually saying that it's two groups of anointed, but they form one generation. Okay. So I then started thinking, I wonder if any of the folk in the Kingdom Hall fully understand, is it two generations or is it two groups? Is it one generation? Just how could they explain it properly? So, anyway, one of the mornings I was going to work in Edinburgh and I gets off the train at Waverley Station. So I got the steps, and usually there's a couple of carts either side of the side entrance. So I saw there was two older brothers to the side. So I goes off to have a word with them. And didn't say who I was, didn't say I was a witness. I just said I've been looking at this video, and I said, could you explain to me how many
Explain.
explain how many groups of anointed are there?
Yeah.
So they kind of looked at each other, and the first one started talking about the anointed and the great crowd, and the other brother looks at him and realizes he's not making sense. So he stops him and he says, "No, actually." And I can't exactly remember what this brother said, but I think he might have tried to say about the two groups of anointed, but he was having great difficulty actually explaining it. So after he had corrected the first brother and says, "No, that's wrong," I had to stop him and say, "Well, actually, I'm afraid you're wrong as well." I said, "Because there isn't two groups of the anointed in the last days. Your literature actually says there are three groups of anointed." And they kind of looked at each other, and they hadn't picked up on this. Whereas I looked at one of their books. I'm not sure if it's a book or a pamphlet, but it's called God's Kingdom Rules. And in paragraph 16, it says, "How then may we understand Jesus' words about this generation?" It says, "The generation consists of two overlapping groups of anointed ones, and at least some of those in the second group will live to see the beginnings of the coming tribulation." Then it says, "The two groups form one generation because their lives as anointed Christians overlapped for a time." Okay. But here's the thing, and these brothers had missed this, and I reckon a lot of people miss this. But in the footnote, it says, "Anyone who was anointed after the death of the last of the anointed ones in the first group, that is, after those who witnessed the beginnings of pangs of distress in 1914 would not be part of this generation, right? So it's saying that if a person today claims to be of the anointed, but all the first group are now all dead, right? So if you're now
Yeah.
today going to claim that you're of the anointed, your life has not overlapped with that first group, or at least it hasn't overlapped while you were claiming to be anointed. So the
Yeah.
society is saying there's the 1914 group, there's the late 20th century group, the second group, and their lives overlap. And because of that, they're one generation. But all these ones today in recent years who've been claiming to be of the anointed, because they're claiming that when the first group are gone, they can't be part of the generation. So there's actually a group of the anointed who don't form the generation. According to what the society is saying. I know it's confusing and it's weird. Play the video back and listen to what I said again. But
So right, I know. So I just want to get this because I've got this wrong because when this generation thing first came out, which was I'm trying to think when this was, maybe about 1996, something like that, or
95,
whatever,
yeah.
95. Okay, I thought it was saying. I didn't realize. I thought the generation referred to the generation. I see your point now, because obviously it must refer to that generation because it'd be the ones who first saw 1914, and they were all of the anointed, weren't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
The ones, yeah. So you're right. I just always I never thought about it just being the spirit anointed ones, but then when they said that it overlapped, I thought it referred to all the rest of the great crowd who overlapped the guys who witnessed those things. There's all generate like my generation, your generation overlaps our grandfathers who were there, so we could say we overlap them. Right? I didn't realize it was exclusively. I hadn't thought about it for the anointed ones. Okay.
Yeah. So it's basically saying if you're of the anointed in the late 20th century, and you're anointed whilst there were still some of the anointed, like brother Franz, they say in the video. So if you were anointed whilst he was alive, but you weren't alive yourself to see 1914, then you're an
Yes.
anointed of the second group. And both those groups,
Yeah.
the ones that saw 1914 and the ones since who didn't see it but who are alive at the same time, they form one generation, right? Two
Are they
groups.
the overlapping generation?
So they're the overlapping generation, according to the witnesses. But then, as this
Right.
book says, as we've seen in recent years, the numbers of the claiming to be of the anointed has been rising. Whereas in our day, the whole point was the numbers
It's
were
going
going
down.
down, right? But
Yeah.
now they're going up the way. So they've seen all these ones claiming now to be the anointed, and which the witnesses have actually said that they've basically inferred that anyone claiming to be of the anointed now could possibly have a mental deficiency. That there's something wrong with them. You know,
Does
they
that include the ones who are now members of the governing body?
well, well, this is it. There's ones on the governing body younger than us, you know.
Yes.
Um, so there's a third group who don't form part of the generation. So I say it seems crazy, but that's the fact. And I don't think most witnesses themselves even realize that or get that point. But it raised a question with me that if the second group, those who didn't see 1914 but were alive, who were anointed when the first group were alive, if
Yeah.
they overlap and become part of the same generation because their lives overlapped, then for that matter, if the third group become anointed and overlap with the second group, do they
Yeah.
not become part of the same generation because they're overlapping with the second group, right? The second group are part of the generation. So I think their reasoning, when you look at it logically, their own reasoning just doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold together. But the other thing that about this whole generation change was you've got to ask the question. They say it's new light, but new light should not contradict old light. Any new light, any new understanding should clarify or make it better, easier to understand what was previously held to be
Yes.
truth, you know?
Yes.
So it shouldn't contradict the old light. So I looked at the Watchtower 1984, May 15th. Now, this is the classic Watchtower with the front cover with a group of these older ones, older anointed, who are all in their 80s and beyond.
Yeah.
And they're all
Yeah.
looking forward. And the headline
Yeah.
was The Generation That Will Not Pass Away, the 1914 generation. So that infamous Watchtower, it had said, just as Jesus' prophecies regarding Jerusalem were fulfilled within, and this is a point, fulfilled within the lifespan of the generation of the year 33 CE, so his
Yes.
prophecies regarding the time of the end will be fulfilled within the lifespan of the generation of 1914. Couldn't be clearer. You know,
Mm,
it's saying that the
mm,
lifespan of those in 33
yeah. Yeah.
CE, they wouldn't die before Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled in that first century. So likewise, the lifespan of those who saw 1914 would not end before it was all fulfilled in the modern centuries, 20th century. So they clearly said the lifespan of those people who saw these events, right? Um, Whereas in the Watchtower 2014, jumping forward, this is where they really kind of mention the change. Now, they say this infamous phrase, we understand, right? I'll come back to that in a moment. We understand that in mentioning this generation, Jesus was referring to two groups of anointed Christians. First group, 1914, they readily discerned the sign in that year. The second group included in this generation are the anointed contemporaries of the first group. They were anointed during the time that those of the first group were still on earth. And then it says, thus, not every anointed person today is included in this generation. Right? So again, that's the third group who can
Yes.
be anointed, but they're not part of the
Yes.
generation. That makes no sense to what the Watchtower 84 had said,
Yeah.
or what Jesus obviously had meant about one generation.
Yeah.
Um, so the question then comes to mind, were there overlapping groups in the first century? Right? When Jesus said that this generation will not pass away, did those words did he mean that there'd be two groups in that generation? Is there anything in that phrase that would suggest two groups? Clearly, there isn't, right? And that generation from 33 CE to 70 CE, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, we're talking
Yeah.
about 37 years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So anyone who was alive in 33 and old enough to understand what was going on, they easily would still be
Yeah.
alive all the way
Yeah.
through that 37 years to see
Yeah.
70 CE. So there was no need for a second group. He could only have been referring to one group, those who were alive at that point in time to witness these things. So there's nothing in his words that would suggest in the 20th century that this generation would mean two groups. It would surely just mean the same, have the same meaning as he had in the first century, right?
Yeah.
So he could only be referring to one group, um, which makes the understanding in 84 makes sense for what it is. It's a reasonable exegesis of what that scripture was saying. The lifespan of one generation. There's nothing in it that could suggest two different groups within the one period of time, you know? So it doesn't make sense. Now, the second experience, I forgot to say, when I was speaking to those brothers in Waverley, after they had corrected them on their understanding of generation, we then moved on to the Archangel Michael again. And I brought that up, and the two of them had no idea again, couldn't explain nothing. And at this point, the second brother looks at me and he says, "Go away, go away." He says, "You're an apostate. You're trying to destroy my faith." You know, he says, "You're an apostate. Go." And I'm saying to him, "I've not said anything to you yet. I've not explained anything what I think. I've only asked
Yeah.
you to justify,
You, your
explain
beliefs.
your
Yeah.
beliefs, and you've been
Yeah.
unable to. But that makes me an apostate. Surely, if you can't explain your beliefs properly, maybe you're the apostate. You know, you can't explain it properly."
Yeah.
Anyway, another time, um, TK Maxx in Ayr, where they
All
usually
right.
stand, came across a brother and a sister, a older married couple, and I raised the generations with them. And I think I'd asked him again about, could you explain how many generations there were, or were there two groups in the first century, right? Um, if they're saying that there's two groups making the generation today, was there two groups in the first century? Could you explain? So anyway, he's looking at me and his wife's standing behind him. Okay. So I've got one eye on him and I've got one eye on her behind him. So he goes to right. He says, "Well, there was the anointed, and there was the great crowd." Right. So
In the first
exactly, I'm,
century.
I'm looking, I'm looking at him the same, and with my right eye, I can see his wife standing behind him, and she's going, you know, and
No.
eventually she kind of taps him in the shoulder, and she's going, "No, no, 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 that's not right." She says, "There
No.
was no great crowd in the first century," and he's
Yeah.
going, and I says to him, "Are you an elder?" He says, "Yeah." I says, "What?"
Oh my God.
And you're saying the great crowd were in the first century, you know?
No, God.
Unbelievable. So she stopped him before he embarrassed himself any further. But on this point, there's again three different translations I looked at on this passage, which I think are really good. Um, there's the New Testament in Contemporary Language by Eugene Peterson, which is this translation again, the Message in
All right.
Contemporary English Language. And it says, Matthew 24:34, he says, Jesus was, "I'm not just saying this for some future generation, but for all of you." Right? So he's saying this generation that will not pass away. He's saying, Jesus is saying it's not for some future generation. Right? So in other words, while the witnesses are saying that it had a modern day fulfillment,
Yes. Yeah.
there's
He's
nothing in
saying.
Jesus' words that says that. It was for that day, right?
Mm.
The New English Bible says the present generation will live to see it all, right? So none of this part of a group are going to die off and a second group are going to then see the end. The New English Bible says the present living generation will live to see it all, right? And then finally, the New Testament in Modern English by J.B. Phillips, again, great translation, this one. Um, he says, "This generation will not disappear till all this has taken place." Right? So that's the insight, the understanding of what Jesus' words were referring to, that those people alive to hear his words and to see the events he mentioned would happen within that 37-year period up to 70 CE. They wouldn't die off, they wouldn't disappear, they would live to see it all. So the idea that the anointed from 1914 passed away and
Mm.
didn't live to see it all contradicts entirely a proper understanding of Matthew 24:34. So modern scriptures just show that that can't be the case. Now, you mentioned about Splains had explained it as contemporaries, one generation. So you spoke about grandfathers and sons.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was thinking about it. For instance, you and me, both born 1962, right? We're of the same generation. We lived through the Kennedy assassinations, Watergate scandal, the Apollo 11 moon landings, the Challenger disaster, the
Mm.
Vietnam War, the Falklands War. Okay, so you and me have shared 40 years of history there with those events. We lived through all that, saw that. Now you've got a son, I've got two sons. They're all in their 30s, approaching 30s, born in the 1990s. Okay, so we've had 40 years of history that they never saw, right?
Yeah.
But we're all living now at the same time. We're contemporaries of each other. Us and
Yes.
our sons are all contemporaries. But are
Mm.
our sons the same generation as us?
No.
By no means. We're
No.
we're different generation. The very fact that they're our sons, we've generated them. They're a different generation. It's that's
Yeah.
what the word means, basically. But they can't be the same generation as we are, you know.
Yeah.
So even though we're contemporaries, we're different generations. So Splain's contemporaneous generations again, just it doesn't make any
Doesn't work.
sense. But here's the point. I'll make this the kind of the final point of the comments tonight. The definition of generation in the Bible. What does the Bible say about generations? So I've just got a few scriptures to run through. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 35, talking about the generation in the desert, with wandering the desert with Moses. Deuteronomy 1:35, not one among these men of this evil generation will see the good land that I swore to
Yeah.
give your fathers. So
Yeah.
because some of those in the desert, in the camp, had been rebellious, and
Yeah.
when the spies had gone into Canaan, I think it was, to spy out the land, they
Yeah.
came back with a false report to kind of put off going into the land because they were frightened. Um, Jehovah says that they were an evil generation. And then in Deuteronomy 2 and verse 14, it says, in the days that we walked from Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the torrent valley of Zared were 38 years, until all the generation of the men of war had come to their end from the midst of the
Yeah.
camp, just as
Yeah.
Jehovah has sworn to them. So
Yeah.
that passage is saying that the evil generation that he wasn't going to allow to go into the promised land, where it was a period of 38 years, and the men of war had to come to their end. They had to pass away first. Okay. Um, and then if we turn to Numbers 32, 11 to 13. I'll not read it all, but it basically says that Israel were to be 40 years in the desert.
Yeah.
And Numbers 14, verses 29 to 34. I might read that. 14. How are we doing for time, Terry?
Playtime.
Right, so, okay. Numbers 14, 29 to 34. Yeah, it says, in this wilderness, your carcasses will fall. Yes, all your registered ones of all your number from 20 years old upward who have
Yeah.
murmured against me. So he was
Yes.
saying that, Joe was saying that when they left Egypt, um, everyone that was 20 years and above were basically men of fighting age. Okay.
Yes.
And anyone below 20 years of age were not considered as such. Okay.
Yes.
So these registered ones who were 20 years that were going to die in the desert.
Yeah.
And then I think it goes on to say, yeah, no, going back to numbers, hold on, numbers 32. Sorry, just a wee second. Numbers 32, 11 to 13. Yeah, here it is. So Numbers 32 and verse 13. So Jehovah's anger blazed against Israel, and he made them wander about in the wilderness for 40 years, until all the generation that was doing evil in the eyes of Jehovah came to their end.
Yeah.
Right? So he talks about this group of the fighting men of an age from 20 years upwards. They had to wander for 40 years so that
Yeah.
that group, now he doesn't say group, he says generation,
Yeah.
right? So in other words, what the scriptures are saying is that the ones who were younger than 20 years when they came out of Egypt were not considered the
Yeah.
same generation as those who were 20 years and older.
Yes.
And the ones who were born in the desert during that sojourn in the desert, they also were not of the same generation as that group of fighting men age, right?
Mm.
So the only ones that passed in to the the promised land were those who were younger, if you like, than that middle generation, that evil generation, the older ones who should have known better. So it's clear when the Bible's talking about the Exodus, there's more than one generation there.
Mm.
Certainly, in my understanding, that's three different groups of people, but only one counted as an evil generation. There was two generations either side of it. Okay, so it shows that the lie, um, that the contemporaneous, because they would have all been living together at the same time at some point. They were all contemporaries. So despite the fact that they were contemporaneous for a good number of years, they weren't the same generation.
Action.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know the interesting thing about this. I did a video about this long time ago, and I think the only people who didn't get, or the ones who went through, were I think the tribe of Levi. I think they were okay, and also the families of the two spies who came back with the good reports. They're okay, but obviously the 10 spies weren't. But the interesting thing is, and the video I did was actually shows. I think there were about 1 million people at this point. It's around about 1 million people who came out of Egypt. It wasn't just the Israelites. It's loads of other people who decided we're out of here, and so it was a massive, great big amount. But the interesting thing is, if you actually look at the ages according to the Bible of people who were living at that point, everybody was living round about 100 years of age, round about this time in the Bible. But the interesting thing is that it says that anybody over the age of 20 would not get into the promised land. So that would have meant that back then nobody was naturally dying at the age of 60. They were naturally dying 40 years later, which meant that for Jehovah's promise that none of this generation 20 or over were going to go into the promised land, which meant that during those 40 years, he would then have had to unnaturally cause them all to gradually die so that nobody over the age of 60 would have got into there unless they were part of Levi or part of the two spies family. So that's why I said that he actually caused the premature deaths of nearly 1 million people.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, but it's clear that in his mind, the way he refers to them, he's talking about different generations,
Yeah,
which again, it seems reasonable because, as I say, people can be contemporaneous, but not of the same generation, like us and our
yeah,
sons. But also, I
yeah,
mean, you can define generations in different ways because mean, you can define a generation by events. Like, for instance, 9/11 was a huge event in time where our sons would have been old enough to witness that. So we all lived
Yeah,
within, was it 2001,
yeah,
9/11 occurred. So
yeah,
we were all contemporaneous at that point. We all saw that. So you could say that we were the 9/11 generation,
yeah.
and include ourselves in that. It just depends on whether you're defining generation um, as a birth generation or a generation surrounding particular events. You know, um,
Yes,
but the idea that you can have two separate groups who were, uh, although contemporaneous, could form the same generation that
yeah,
Jesus was speaking of, which
yeah,
only covered a period of 37 years. I mean, the
yes,
Bible does talk about, even in some parts, talks about generation just being 40 years. And also, by some extension, um, I'm maybe ad-libbing a wee bit here, but I'm pretty sure recently I came across a quote in the Watchtower where it said that the Hebrews counted a generation as 78 years, right? But how many years has it been since 1914? We're talking about 111.
on
You know?
11.
So even by that token, we're way beyond
Wow,
any
sorry.
biblical definition of a generation, how long it should last. Um,
Oh, it's
but
interesting when you're reading the other translations that it seemed as though Jesus was saying, referring to the people alive then, that they would see the destruction of the temple and all these reports of earthquakes and food shortages, which we know occurred at that time period. But those other translations are giving the idea that all the fulfillment for Jesus's Matthew 24 were fulfilled in that generation, and that there was no extension to occur 2,000 years later in the 20th century.
exactly, which is the point I was making at Queen Street to Brother Bouncer, that
Right.
when you actually read the text in Scripture in the New Testament, Paul's writings and Jesus' words, they believe the end was coming then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
They weren't
yeah,
saying they weren't saying, for instance, in Acts, when they say to Jesus, apparently, and they say to him, is this the time now? And he
yeah.
apparently replies and says, it's not for you to know the times and the seasons, right? But he didn't say, and they didn't subsequently say, no, this is all for the 20th century. We're going to have to
Mm,
wait 2,000
mm.
years. There's none of that.
Yeah,
Paul's writings, etc., they all understood that it was going to happen within their
then yeah,
lifetime.
exactly, exactly. Yeah,
So
it's
it could only
what.
be fulfilled then.
Yeah,
Sorry,
and
Ken.
another interesting thing was about the what I've always said many, many times. If the greater hope for the majority of the people living in the world then, all the ones who died before Pentecost, all those deadens, right? All the ones who weren't going to ascend to heaven. And then subsequently, once 144,000 figure had been reached, we're talking about billions of people who are going to maybe get a resurrection or will be alive when Armageddon comes. How come, and then going to live in a paradise earth forever and stroke budgies, how come there's hardly any reference to the greater hope? You think in the Bible, there'd be tons and tons of references to this paradisiac um, life that most people would want, instead of not really mentioning it at all. But that would be for the hope for the majority, but for the hope for the minority, there's loads about it. And so this is why I always say to people, how come there aren't more religions out there who believe in this paradise on earth? Because the Bible clearly only fleetingly mentions it, which is open to any sort of interpretation at all.
Mhm. Yeah. And also, I just remembered that I was going to go back to, yeah. Can I just go back to
You've got four
that point?
minutes. 4
4 minutes, right?
minutes.
Quickly then. Watchtower 2014. Remember, we said it. They start off by saying, "We understand that," in mentioning this generation. That expression, "we understand." Now, what is it they understand? They never actually say why they've come to this understanding. But
Right.
surely it could only mean at this point, it could only mean we understand that what we said before hasn't come true. Reading between the lines,
Yeah.
that's what it's saying. We
Yeah.
used to say that the generation that saw 1914 wouldn't die off, they wouldn't pass
Yeah.
away, as that front cover had suggested. So if they're saying we understand something new, it
Yes.
means that what we understood before was wrong.
Oh.
So
Well, that. Yeah.
who's
Yeah.
wrong? Was it
Yeah.
them or was it Jehovah?
Yeah.
Right? Was Jehovah wrong?
Yeah, this is the thing that we always say to the Carters. It's the same thing. Who did the confusing bit here? Was it Jehovah's Holy Spirit intentionally confusing things here, or is the fact that these people are so thick as shit they don't understand an easy explanation of a scripture? The fact that they use that phrasing there, understand, means at the end of the day they can always further down the line say, well, we misunderstood, or now we further understand. So it's not trying to set anything in stone, as it were. It's going to be the
Yeah.
get out, because they know they're going to change it a little bit further down the line. However, we now understand. It's a lot of bollocks.
Yeah. And the other thing is when they say we understand, reading between the lines, what it's saying to the reader is if you don't agree with what we're going to tell you, if you don't accept what we understand, the we there is
Yes.
the organization, is
Yeah.
God's spirit directed organization. So if we understand this new belief and you don't, if you don't accept it, then you're
Yeah.
not part of the we and you don't
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
understand, right? So they're basically between the lines, the psychology of it is saying that you have to accept this,
Yes.
otherwise you're an apostate
Yeah. Yeah.
because
That's mad,
we
isn't it?
understand. It's
Yes.
the way they use the language
Yeah.
is controlling.
It's it's very clever. Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've come to the end,
Mhm.
But again, thank you for your wonderful insight and the time that you spent. To certainly, like I said, for anybody watching now, hopefully you're doing the hard work for us.
Pleasure.
It's appreciated, and hopefully we'll do this again next week. So
Sure.
anyway,
I was just going to
see
say,
you.
if people watching this, if they like it, just give the video a like, and that way YouTube will push it out to more people to see and hear it. But thanks again, Terry.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dino. See you again. All right.
See you later. Bye for now.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye. Bye bye. Bye bye.